They were born into a world holding its breath. The 1960s weren't gentle. They were chaotic, loud, and unpredictable. Televisions flickered with images of wars, protests, assassinations, and a society in turmoil. For a child growing up in that era, the world didn't feel safe, stable, or fair. It was raw, immediate, and often frightening. Yet, even in their small, fragile bodies, they learned to notice the gravity of it all. The psychology of a child exposed to constant uncertainty is unique. Unlike generations shielded from harsh realities, these children absorbed the instability around them. They weren't told to look away from political debates, nuclear threats, or the streets filled with angry crowds. Instead, they were present, watching events unfold before their eyes, feeling the tension without a language to explain it. This early immersion in a volatile environment shaped a mental framework unlike any other, one where vigilance, awareness, and adaptability became second nature. Children of the 1960s learned early that unpredictability was the norm. Adults whispered about wars, governments failed spectacularly, and leaders were assassinated. These weren't just stories. They were daily lessons in the fragility of life. And psychologically, exposure to such instability cultivated a rare trait: resilience born not from comfort but from necessity. Their nervous systems learned to anticipate danger, to respond, and to carry the weight of uncertainty without collapsing. What's remarkable is that these children were not paralyzed by fear. The human mind, even at a young age, is adept at creating coping mechanisms. For kids immersed in chaos, adaptation became instinctive. They developed an unspoken understanding that life doesn't wait for you to be ready. If you wanted to survive, you had to move, adjust, and endure. In psychological terms, this forged a type of early self-regulation, the ability to manage internal states, tolerate stress, and keep functioning under pressure. Yet, the 1960s child also learned another subtle psychological lesson. The world is not always fair, and people are not always predictable. Witnessing adults argue, streets erupt in protests, and communities divide taught them to navigate ambiguity without guidance. They internalized responsibility for their own reactions, building a form of mental independence before the term self-reliance even existed. This early development of autonomy was critical. It meant that when chaos came knocking, they didn't crumble, they adjusted. Even their moments of play and freedom carried lessons. Roaming the neighborhood without constant supervision, experiencing minor failures and small victories firsthand, children of the 1960s absorbed life as it happened. They learned that actions have consequences, that falling is part of growth, and that endurance is a quiet form of power. Psychologists would call this experiential learning, but for them, it was just life. In essence, growing up in the 1960s created a psychology shaped by observation, adaptation, and internalization. They didn't have safety nets. They had instincts and experience. And though the world was loud, fractured, and uncertain, it planted the seeds of resilience, self-awareness, and emotional fortitude that would define them for decades to come. The children of the 1960s didn't just live in a world of uncertainty. They grew up inside it. While other generations might have been protected, shielded by the illusion of stability, these kids were forced to navigate life without a manual. They learned, often painfully, that the world doesn't pause for you to feel safe. Adaptation was no longer a skill. It was a necessity. Psychologically, this environment produced a unique type of resilience. Children were exposed to the harsh realities of life early on. Wars, political upheaval, social unrest. But unlike many modern children, they weren't buffered by constant guidance or reassurance. Instead, they observed, absorbed, and processed events in real time. This constant exposure shaped their brains to anticipate change, tolerate stress, and find solutions independently. Emotional survival became a subconscious habit. When something went wrong, they didn't run. They adapted. Pain was present, but it was internalized. Unlike later generations encouraged to express feelings openly, the 1960s child learned that suffering was a private teacher. Emotions were acknowledged silently, processed internally, and acted upon without fanfare. This created a form of self-reliance few could understand, the ability to carry emotional weight without collapsing under it. Psychologists describe this as emotional regulation, but for them it was instinctive. They didn't need terms or therapy, they had experience. Freedom in childhood also played a profound role. With less supervision and fewer structured rules, they were allowed to explore consequences firsthand. Falling off a bike, arguing with peers, or navigating the dangers of city streets without adult interference taught critical lessons. Life has immediate feedback, and growth comes from trial, error, and persistence. Each misstep reinforced self-trust and problem-solving skills, laying the foundation for a resilient adult mind. Another psychological aspect was their early confrontation with moral ambiguity. They witnessed neighbors debating the Vietnam War, families grappling with loss, and communities divided by politics. From a young age, they understood that right and wrong were not always clear, that people could fail, and that circumstances often dictated outcomes. This awareness nurtured empathy, discernment, and the ability to navigate complex social dynamics, skills often underdeveloped in generations raised in more sheltered environments. What set this generation apart was how they internalized responsibility. Without constant oversight, they learned to monitor their own behavior, regulate impulses, and anticipate consequences. Their inner psychological compass strengthened early, creating a sense of autonomy and control even amid external chaos. They developed a quiet confidence. They didn't need approval to act because they had already practiced acting responsibly long before adulthood. Finally, these early lessons forged endurance. Growing up fast meant that setbacks were inevitable, but children learned that persistence mattered more than immediate comfort. Adaptation and emotional survival became intertwined with daily life. Every challenge faced in childhood, from political unrest to personal setbacks, was another rehearsal for life's uncertainties. Psychologists call this resilience training through lived experience, and it created adults capable of facing change without fear, hardship without despair, and uncertainty without panic. The 1960s child was a master of adaptation. Their psychology was shaped less by rules and more by experience, less by theory and more by necessity. Growing up fast wasn't optional, it was survival. And this early encounter with life's instability created adults with a profound capacity to endure, reflect, and navigate a world that would always demand their resilience. By the time children of the 1960s reached adolescence, something extraordinary had already taken shape inside them: inner authority. This wasn't something taught in classrooms or explained by parents. It was forged in the crucible of experience. Growing up in a world of unpredictability, they learned to trust themselves before anyone else could. Their decisions, small and large, were guided not by external approval but by an instinct honed through trial, error, and observation. Psychologists would describe this as a deep sense of autonomy, but for them it was simply life. The freedom they experienced in childhood played a pivotal role. Unlike modern children under constant supervision, 1960s kids roamed neighborhoods, explored streets, and discovered the world largely unsupervised. There were no trackers, no cameras, no adult hovering over every step. And in that freedom came responsibility. Every scraped knee, every argument, every small failure carried a lesson. Actions have consequences, and you alone must navigate them. Over time, this built an internal compass, a quiet confidence in their judgment that would guide them well into adulthood. Psychologically, this self-reliance was transformative. Children internalized problem-solving as a habit, not a skill to be learned later. If something went wrong, they didn't wait for someone to fix it. They adjusted, improvised, and continued. That ability to self-regulate and take independent action is a hallmark of inner authority. They learned that survival, emotional, social, and practical, depended on their own decisions, not on the approval of others. This early cultivation of inner authority also shaped their relationships. Because they trusted their judgment, they didn't feel compelled to seek constant validation. Silence became a strength, reflection a habit, and observation a tool. They listened more than they spoke, measured words carefully, and acted deliberately. Loyalty, commitment, and consistency emerged naturally, not as moral obligations but as reflections of their inner stability. Psychologists often link this to emotional intelligence, the ability to understand and manage one's own emotions while navigating social dynamics effectively. Interestingly, their independence was not reckless. It was tempered by experience. Having learned consequences firsthand, they balanced freedom with foresight. They could assess risk, adapt strategies, and endure setbacks without external reassurance. This balance between autonomy and prudence created adults capable of both leadership and quiet resilience. Where other generations might seek external direction, the 1960s generation relied on their inner voice, their inner authority. Even in adulthood, this psychological trait manifests clearly. They make decisions after thoughtful consideration rather than impulse. They endure hardships without complaint and take responsibility for their lives without deflecting blame. Their sense of self is rooted less in recognition and more in competence, less in approval and more in experience. This inner authority allows them to navigate complexity, embrace uncertainty, and face challenges with measured confidence. In short, the psychology of the 1960s child nurtured a profound self-reliance. Freedom, unsupervised exploration, and exposure to real-world consequences created adults with inner authority, people who trust themselves, act responsibly, and navigate life with quiet strength. It wasn't taught, it was lived, and that lived experience continues to define a generation that faced chaos, adapted, and emerged not just surviving, but equipped to thrive in a world that rarely offered guarantees. The children of the 1960s were shaped not just by chaos and freedom, but by the subtle lessons of emotional complexity. Their psychology was molded in a world that demanded endurance, yet rarely offered comfort. They learned early that life wasn't about expressing every feeling openly, but about understanding, managing, and navigating emotions with quiet skill. Vulnerability was not a public display. It was a private process, carried internally, often unnoticed by the world, yet profoundly influencing their character. This emotional depth created a generation capable of remarkable loyalty. People who grew up during this turbulent era understood that relationships, commitments, and promises carried weight beyond fleeting emotions. They were attuned to the struggles of others, not because it was trendy or taught in school, but because survival and cooperation were intertwined. Loyalty wasn't performative. It was a natural extension of their lived experience. Psychologically, this reflects an advanced form of social intelligence, understanding the emotional currents of a group while balancing personal responsibility. Endurance became another defining trait. The children of the 1960s were familiar with instability. Wars, social upheaval, and cultural shifts surrounded them. They learned that comfort was fleeting, stability fragile, and security often uncertain. From a psychological perspective, this cultivated stress tolerance, the ability to withstand discomfort, persist through adversity, and act despite uncertainty. They didn't seek struggle for its own sake, but they respected it because they knew it was part of life. Endurance was a survival mechanism that became a character strength, quietly reinforcing resilience and adaptability. Their respect for struggle also shaped their approach to achievement and effort. Unlike later generations who often expect comfort and predictability, these individuals understand that meaningful progress comes through effort, patience, and persistence. They internalize the idea that life isn't about avoiding difficulty. It's about navigating it with intelligence, perseverance, and courage. Psychologists would recognize this as grit, a combination of passion and perseverance applied over time, but for them, it was simply the rhythm of life. Emotionally, the 1960s generation may appear reserved or distant to outsiders. Their feelings are complex, layered, and often private. Yet beneath that quiet surface lies a rich internal world capable of deep empathy, unwavering loyalty, and steady support. They show up when it matters most, not for recognition or applause, but because commitment is ingrained. Their emotional intelligence allows them to respond to crises with calm, think before acting, and offer stability when the world seems to be unraveling. Ultimately, the psychology of this generation reflects a balance between strength and sensitivity. They carry the weight of history in their nervous systems, yet they are capable of profound compassion. They endure, they persist, and they remain loyal, not because it is expected, but because life demanded it. Their emotional complexity, endurance, and respect for struggle are not relics of the past. They are enduring traits that continue to shape their interactions, decisions, and influence on those around them. In short, the children of the 1960s grew into adults who understand the intricate dance of human emotion. Resilience paired with sensitivity, loyalty paired with discernment, and endurance paired with wisdom. Their psychology is a testament to survival, growth, and the quiet power of experiencing and respecting the full spectrum of life's challenges.
الحدود ليست عدوانا بل حكمة. أن تضع حدا يعني أنك تعرف قيمة سلامك. الرواقي لا يقطع الجسور بغضب بل يعبرها ثم يعلم متى لا يعود. يترك الباب مغلقا بهدوء ويكمل طريقه دون أن يلتفت. انفصل دون غضب. لا تجعل البعد معركة. دع الأشياء تأخذ مسارها الطبيعي. كل مرة تحمي فيها مساحتك الداخلية أنت تعيد التوازن إلى حياتك. ومع الوقت تشعر أن عقلك أخف وأن أفكارك أهدأ وأن القلب لم يفقد إنسانيته. ليس مطلوبا منك أن تكون قاسيا لتكون قويا. القوة أن تعرف متى تبق ومتى ترحل ومتى تصمت. استبعدهم عن عقلك لتحمي سلامك. وأبقهم في قلبك بإنسانية دون أن تسمح لهم أن يؤذوك مرة أخرى. هذه هي الحكمة الرواقية. بعد بلا كره وسلام بلا صراع. الجدال يخفه أما التقدم فيبقى. كم من كلمات قيلت وكم من معارك رأي انتهت ولم يبقى منها شيء. في المقابل كل خطوة نمو تترك أثرا. الرواقي لا يضيع طاقته في إقناع الآخرين بل يوجهها نحو بناء نفسه. يفهم أن أقوى رد ليس كلمة بل حالة يعيشها. عندما يشكك أحد فيك أو يقلل من قدرك أو يراقب خطواتك بنية الانتقاد يكون الإغراء كبيرا. أن تدافع، أن تفسر، أن تثبت. لكن الرواقي يتوقف. يسأل نفسه: هل سيغير الجدال شيئا؟ أم أن التقدم الصامت أبلغ؟ وغالبا يكون الجواب واضحا: دع نموك يتكلم. الأفعال لا تجادل ولا تحتاج إلى تبرير. هي تظهر وحدها. كل مرة تحسن فيها نفسك أنت تغلق فم الشك دون أن تنطق. كل مرة تلتزم فيها بطريقك أنت تثبت أن الثبات أطول عمرا من الانتقاد. الرواقية تعلمك أن تجعل حياتك هي الرسالة. في طريق النمو ستواجه المقارنة. ستنظر إلى تقدم غيرك وتشعر أحيانا أنك أبطأ أو أنك تأخرت. وهنا يكمن فخ خطير. المقارنة تفقدك بوصلتك. الرواقي لا ينافس الناس بل ينافس نفسه الأمس. يسأل: هل أنا أفضل قليلا مما كنت؟ إذا كان الجواب نعم فهو في الطريق الصحيح. الاستمرار هو السر. ليس التغيير المفاجئ ولا القفزات الكبيرة بل التقدم اليومي الصغير. خطوة كل يوم، عمل صغير بلا ضجيج، التزام حتى في الأيام التي لا يراك فيها أحد. هذه هي القوة التي لا تنكسر. الانتقاد يمل أما الاستمرار فيبني. دع النتائج تعيد كتابة القصة. ليس عليك أن تصحح صورتك في أذهان الناس فهذا خارج عن سيطرتك. عليك فقط أن تعمل بإخلاص. ومع الوقت تتغير الرواية. من كانوا يشكون سيصمتون ومن كانوا ينتقدون سيراقبون. ليس انتقاما بل نتيجة طبيعية. الرواقي لا يحتاج إلى التشفي. نموه كاف. يعرف أن أفضل طريقة للتعامل مع الشك هي أن لا تحمله معك. اتركه خلفك وسر في طريقك. كل تحسن صغير سيتراكم وكل تراكم سيصنع فرقا كبيرا. في النهاية ستدرك أن حياتك أصبحت هي الجواب. لا تفسيرات طويلة ولا مواجهات متعبة. مجرد واقع يتحدث عن نفسه. وهذا هو أعلى أشكال القوة. أن تجعل نموك يقود وأن تترك الأفعال تقول كل شيء. في لحظات الضعف يندفع الإنسان غريزيا نحو الشرح، نحو التبرير، نحو إثبات نفسه. يريد أن يسمع، أن يفهم، أن يقنع. ولكن الرواقي يتوقف عند هذه النقطة. يفهم أن كثرة الكلام في بعض المواقف لا تزيده قوة بل تنقصه. الصمت هنا ليس هروبا بل حفظ للكرامة. عندما تجد نفسك تلاحق الانتباه أو تنتظر اعترافا أو تشعر بالحاجة أن يراك الآخرون تذكر أن هذا الشعور لا يأتي من قوة بل من نقصان مؤقت في الداخل. الرواقي لا يطارد التصفيق لأنه يعرف أن التصفيق صوت عابر أما القيمة فثابتة. الصمت يربك من يعتاد أن يراك تفسر نفسك. الصمت يكشف من يطلب سلطة عليك عبر رد فعلك. حين لا تشرح ولا تدافع ولا تستعطف أنت تقول بهدوء: أنا مستقر في موقفي. هذه قوة لا تعلن بل تلاحظ. في الفلسفة الرواقية الكرامة لا تحتاج إلى شهود. إذا كنت صادقا مع نفسك ومنسجما مع قيمك فلا حاجة لكل هذا الضجيج. كثير ممن يطلبون الانتباه يخشون الصمت لأنه يجبرهم على مواجهة أنفسهم. أما أنت فتتعلم أن تسكن داخله. اختيار الصمت لا يعني أن تكبت حزنك أو تتجاهل ألمك بل يعني أن لا تضعه في أيدي من لا يقدره. ليس كل أحد يستحق قصتك، ولا كل أحد يستحق شرحك. الرواقي يميز بين من يصغي ومن يستخدم كلماتك ضدك. مع الوقت ستلاحظ شيئا عجيبا: كلما قل شرحك زاد ثقلك. كلما انسحبت من ساحة الانتباه انتبه الناس إليك أكثر، ليس لأنك تسعى لذلك، بل لأن الحضور الحقيقي لا يحتاج إلى طلب. القوة الهادئة تفرض بنفسها. الرواقي يعرف أن المسافة أحيانا أشكال الاحترام للذات. أن تترفع عن الجري خلف الانتباه، أن تقف مستقيما دون أن تثبت، أن تكتفي بذاتك. هذه ليست برودة، بل نضج. في النهاية ستجد أن حاجتك للناس قد قلت، لا لأنك انعزلت، بل لأنك انتميت إلى نفسك. الصمت حماك، والضبط ثبتك، والقوة الداخلية أعطتك سلاما لا يزول مع غياب الانتباه. وعندها تفهم أن أقوى موقف أحيانا هو أن لا تقول شيئا،